You're 8 years old, and today you came with your father to watch the construction of the new church. It's 589 AD in Toledo, capital of the Visigothic kingdom. Everyone is excited because this church will celebrate King Richard's conversion to Catholicism. It's going to be a magnificent structure. Priests and master builders are digging the foundation. Then something strange happens. One of the priests brings a small child, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The child is crying, calling for his mother. The priest lowers him into the deep pit at the center of the foundation. The child begins to scream, but no one intervenes. The masons start placing stones. Around the pit, the screaming continues, then slowly becomes muffled. Stops. Your father's hand is on your shoulder, gripping tightly. Better not look, he says quietly, but you've already seen, and now you understand. Every great building has a child at its foundation, buried alive, because the Visigoths believe that to make a structure strong, you need a soul, an innocent soul, and the price of innocence is being younger than 8 years old. Tonight I'll tell you about Europe's Dark Ages' most horrifying tradition, foundation sacrifice, human pillars, and a practice that lasted for centuries that modern archaeology is now confirming with bones. Before diving into this forgotten horror of medieval construction, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared need to understand humanity's capacity for both magnificent creation and terrible cruelty. Foundation sacrifice is one of humanity's oldest and most widespread practices, found in virtually every major civilization throughout history. The basic concept is simple and horrifying. To ensure a building's strength and longevity, a living being, preferably human, should be incorporated into its foundation. The sacrifice's spirit would then protect and strengthen the structure forever. This wasn't a practice limited to primitive peoples or isolated incidents. Foundation sacrifice has been documented in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, pre-Columbian America, and throughout Europe. But it's in early medieval Europe, particularly among the Germanic tribes that inherited the Roman Empire's ruins, that we find some of the most systematic and well-documented examples. And among these tribes, the Visigoths stand out. The Visigoths were a Germanic people who migrated into Roman territory in the 4th century, eventually establishing a powerful kingdom that controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula and parts of southern France. They were sophisticated by the standards of their time, maintaining elements of Roman law and administration while developing their own distinct culture. They built impressive structures, churches, palaces, bridges, and fortifications. And according to both contemporary accounts and modern archaeological evidence, many of these structures were built on foundations that contained human remains, deliberately placed there during construction. Let's understand the worldview that made this practice not just acceptable but necessary. The Visigoths, like most Germanic peoples of their era, inhabited a world filled with spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. Buildings weren't just physical structures but spiritual entities that required protection from evil influences. A new construction was vulnerable, a disruption of the natural order that could attract malicious spirits or bad fortune. The solution was to provide the building with its own protective spirit, a guardian that would ward off danger and ensure the structure's stability. And what better guardian than a human soul? But not just any human. The sacrifice had to be innocent, uncorrupted by sin, which in practice meant young children. The younger, the better. Infants were ideal, but children up to about 7 or 8 years old were considered acceptable. This created a horrifying calculus for Visigothic communities. When a major construction project began, particularly for important buildings like churches, fortifications, or bridges, the question wasn't whether to perform a foundation sacrifice but whose child would be chosen. And the selection process reveals much about the social hierarchies and moral compromises of early medieval society. Orphans were the easiest targets. Without family to protest or seek vengeance, orphan children could be selected with minimal social disruption. Church records from the period sometimes mention children given to God's service or consecrated to the foundation, euphemisms that likely referred to foundation sacrifice. An orphan raised by the church could be presented as a willing offering, though the concept of consent when dealing with a 5-year-old is obviously meaningless. Children of slaves or servants were also vulnerable. In Visigothic society, as in most medieval cultures, the children of unfree people had limited legal protection. A master could essentially do what he wished with his slaves' children, including offering them for foundation sacrifice. This was sometimes presented as an honor. The child would have the privilege of serving a great purpose, but the coercion was always present. Even children of free families weren't entirely safe, particularly in cases of extreme poverty or debt. Historical records contain references to families donating children to building projects in exchange for debt forgiveness or material support. The transaction was couched in religious religious language, the child was being given to God, would become part of a holy structure, but the reality was a desperate trade, a child's life for the family's survival. The actual process of foundation sacrifice followed a ritualized pattern, though the specific details varied by region and the type of structure being built. Let's walk through what probably happened, based on archaeological evidence, contemporary descriptions, and comparative ethnographic data from similar practices in other cultures. The selection occurred early in the construction process, often during the planning phase. The child would be identified and set apart, sometimes for days or weeks before the actual sacrifice. During this time, the child might receive special treatment, better food, clean clothes, privileged status within the household or community. This served multiple purposes. It elevated the sacrifice from mere murder to sacred ritual. It made the child healthier and therefore a better offering, and psychologically, it made the community's guilt more bearable. If the child was treated well before death, the act felt less like cruelty. On the day of the foundation ceremony, the child would be prepared, bathed, dressed in clean clothing, often white, symbolizing purity, sometimes given wine or other substances to make them calmer or drowsy. Whether this was mercy or pragmatism, making the child easier to manage, is impossible to determine. Probably both. The foundation pit would already be dug, usually in the center of where the structure would stand. For a church, this might be directly under where the altar would eventually be placed. For a bridge, at a key support point. The location was chosen for both practical engineering reasons and spiritual significance. The child would be led or carried to the pit. If the child was old enough to understand what was happening, there would be terror, screaming, desperate attempts to escape. This is where the sedation becomes crucial. A screaming, fighting child would disrupt the sacred nature of the ritual and traumatize the community. A quiet, passive child allowed everyone to maintain the fiction that this was somehow acceptable. The child would be placed in the pit, usually in a standing position. Archaeological evidence shows that foundation sacrifice victims were often found standing upright or kneeling, positioned as if they were supporting the structure above them. This wasn't accidental. The child was literally being made into a human pillar, a living foundation that would eventually become skeletal but would continue to support and protect the building spiritually. In some cases, the child might be secured to prevent movement. Ropes or wooden frames would hold the body in position. In other cases, particularly with very young children or heavily sedated victims, the body might simply be placed in the pit and trusted to remain upright as the construction proceeded. Then came the killing itself, and this is where the archaeological evidence becomes most disturbing. Foundation sacrifice victims died in various ways, but the most common method was live burial. The construction would simply proceed with the child in position. Stones would be placed around and eventually on top of the victim. Death would come slowly, from crushing pressure, from inability to breathe as the space around the child filled with stone and mortar, from shock and terror. Skeletal remains show signs of this horrifying death. Bones are sometimes found in positions suggesting the victim tried to move or protect themselves as the burial progressed. Rib cages show crushing damage. Skulls show fractures from falling stones. But most tellingly, the position of the remains shows that death occurred while construction was ongoing. These children died while the building was being built on top of them. Other methods were also used. Some victims show evidence of having been killed before being placed in the foundation, usually by strangulation or having their throats cut. This was probably considered more merciful, sparing the child the terror of live burial. But mercy is relative when discussing the murder of children for construction purposes. In a few cases, victims show signs of having been decapitated, with the head placed separately from the body in the foundation. This might relate to specific ritual requirements or beliefs about where the spiritual power of the sacrifice was concentrated. Heads, as seats of consciousness and personality, might have been considered particularly powerful talismans. The ceremony would be attended by priests, who would perform blessings and prayers meant to sanctify the sacrifice and bind the child's spirit to the building. The idea wasn't just to kill a child, but to transform that child into a spiritual guardian. The priest's role was to ensure this transformation happened correctly, that the soul didn't simply die but was instead bound to the structure in a specific protective way. After the sacrifice was complete and the foundation was built, the construction would continue normally. But the community would remember what was buried beneath. For some, this was a source of pride. The building was protected by a powerful sacrifice. For others, it was a source of secret shame, a compromise with necessity that couldn't be acknowledged openly. Now let's consider the scale of this practice. Foundation sacrifice wasn't an occasional aberration but a regular feature of major construction projects throughout the Visigothic period and beyond. Archaeological surveys of early medieval sites in Spain, France, and Italy have found evidence of foundation sacrifices in approximately 15 to 20% of excavated religious and civic specific structures from the 5th through 8th centuries. This percentage might seem low until you consider the absolute numbers. Hundreds of churches, dozens of monasteries, countless bridges, fortifications, and civic buildings were constructed during this period. If even 15% incorporated foundation sacrifices, we're talking about hundreds of victims across several centuries. Each one a child, probably between 2 and 8 years old, killed to sanctify a building. Some structures show evidence of multiple sacrifices. Large cathedrals or major fortifications might have children buried at several key points, each corner of a building or each tower of a castle. The great Gothic cathedrals of later medieval Europe likely stand on foundations that contain the bones of sacrificed children, though centuries of construction, destruction, and reconstruction make determining which remains are from foundation sacrifices versus simple burials almost impossible. The practice wasn't limited to the Visigoths. Their Frankish neighbors to the north practiced it. The Lombards in Italy, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the various Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. Foundation sacrifice was a pan-European phenomenon, though different cultures had different frequencies and methods. The Visigoths are highlighted here because the combination of their geographic location, modern Spain's dry climate preserves, remains better than northern Europe's wet soils, and their relatively good contemporary documentation makes their practices easier to study. Contemporary Christian writers were deeply conflicted about foundation sacrifice. On one hand, it was clearly murder, a violation of Christian teaching about the sanctity of human life. On the other hand, the practice was so deeply embedded in cultural tradition that challenging it meant confronting powerful social expectations. Most religious authorities settled on a compromise position. Foundation sacrifice was officially condemned but unofficially tolerated when done with appropriate religious justification. This moral gymnastics is visible in church writings from the period. A 7th century church manual states that human sacrifice is forbidden, then immediately adds an exception for offerings made for the protection of God's houses. Another text condemns the pagan practice of burying slaves with their masters, but says nothing about foundation sacrifice, a telling silence. Some priests justified the practice through creative theology. If the child was baptized before the sacrifice, their soul would go to heaven, so they weren't really being harmed, just their body. If the building was a church, the child was dying in God's service, making them a martyr. If the family consented, it was an act of faith comparable to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. These rationalizations don't withstand serious moral scrutiny, but they allowed the practice to continue with religious sanction. The psychological impact on the communities that practiced foundation sacrifice must have been profound. Imagine living in a society where you know that your local church, the holiest building in your community, stands on the bones of a murdered child. You pray there every week. You take communion at an altar built literally on top of a child's corpse. How do you process that? How do you reconcile the sacred purpose of the building with the horror of its foundation? Most people probably didn't think about it. The sacrifice was done, the building was standing, and life went on. The dead child became invisible, transformed into an abstract spiritual presence rather than a remembered individual. The community collectively chose to forget the specific horror while maintaining a vague awareness of the sacrifice that made their prosperity possible. But some individuals were haunted. Medieval confession manuals contain references to sins related to foundation sacrifice. People confessing to having participated in the selection of children. Parents confessing to having given consent. Workers confessing to having helped with the burial. These confessions reveal that at least some people were tortured by their participation in a practice they knew was wrong but felt powerless to oppose. Children, particularly, must have been terrified. In a society where foundation sacrifice was known to occur, every major construction project would have created fear among vulnerable children. If you were an orphan or the child of slaves, seeing builders arrive to construct a new church meant wondering if you would be selected. The psychological trauma of living under this constant threat is impossible to quantify but must have been significant. Let's examine some specific cases where archaeological evidence gives us particular insight into individual victims. At Archaeological, a Visigothic city in central Spain, excavations uncovered a church foundation containing the remains of a child approximately 6 years old. The skeletal position suggested the child had been standing with arms raised, positioned as if holding up the structure above. Bone analysis showed signs of malnutrition, suggesting this was likely an orphan or slave child, someone from the most vulnerable segment of society. More disturbing, the child's teeth showed evidence of having been recently filed or altered in some way. This might relate to ritual preparation, marking the victim as consecrated for sacrifice. Or it might have been done to identify the child if the body needed to be located later for some ritual purpose. Either way, it indicates deliberate, planned preparation rather than spontaneous violence. At another site, a monastery in southern France, France, archaeologists found 3 children buried at the foundation corners of the main chapel. All were between 4 and 7 years old. Carbon dating confirmed they were buried during the building's construction in the early 7th century. What makes this case particularly noteworthy is that one child showed signs of having been decapitated before burial, one appeared to have been strangled, and one showed evidence of live burial. 3 different methods for 3 different sacrifice victims in the same structure. This variety of methods might reflect different ritual requirements for different positions within the building. Or it might indicate that the practice evolved over the construction period, with methods changing as the community learned what worked spiritually. Or perhaps most depressingly, it suggests that the specific method didn't particularly matter to those performing the sacrifice. The child's death was what mattered, not how it was achieved. One of the most controversial questions about foundation sacrifice is whether the children were always unwilling victims or if some were raised specifically for this purpose. Some historians have suggested that certain children, particularly those born with disabilities or considered unlucky, might have been designated for sacrifice from birth. They would be raised knowing their eventual fate, perhaps told that they had a special destiny as guardians of sacred structures. The practice of foundation sacrifice began to decline in the late 8th and 9th centuries, coinciding with the Carolingian Renaissance and increased church authority over local practices. Charlemagne and his successors issued explicit prohibitions against human sacrifice in any form, including foundation sacrifice. The church's position hardened from ambiguous tolerance to clear condemnation. But the practice didn't disappear overnight. Foundation sacrifice continued in remote regions well into the 11th and 12th centuries. The last well-documented case in Western Europe dates to around 1130, when a bridge in Germany was found to have a child buried in its central pillar. Even after the practice officially ended, folk beliefs about buildings needing spirit guardians persisted, transforming into less lethal traditions like placing symbolic objects or animal remains in foundations. In Eastern Europe, the practice lasted even longer. Balkan legends speak of foundation sacrifices continuing into the 14th century, though these accounts are harder to verify archaeologically. The famous Romanian ballad Mănăstirea Argeșului tells of a builder who must wall up his wife in the foundation of a monastery to make the building stand. While this specific story is legend, it preserves cultural memory of foundation sacrifice practices. The psychological and social factors that enabled foundation sacrifice deserve deeper examination. How did ordinary people justify this horror to themselves? Several mechanisms made the practice psychologically possible. First, the social distance between victims and decision-makers. The people who decided a sacrifice was necessary, kings, bishops, wealthy patrons, weren't generally sacrificing their own children. The victims came from the lowest social classes, people whose lives were already considered less valuable. This made the decision easier for those in power. Second, the religious framing. By presenting the sacrifice as a holy act necessary for God's purposes, the horror was transmuted into something spiritually meaningful. The child wasn't being murdered but was being offered or consecrated. This linguistic shift allowed participants to avoid confronting the reality of what they were doing. Third, the collective nature of responsibility. The sacrifice wasn't performed by a single individual but by a community working together. The priests blessed it. The parents, in some cases, consented. The builders executed it. This diffusion of responsibility allowed each participant to minimize their personal guilt. Fourth, the precedent of tradition. Foundation sacrifice had been practiced for generations, perhaps centuries. "This is how things are done" is a powerful justification for continuing horrific practices. Breaking with tradition requires courage that most people don't possess, especially when the tradition is embedded in religious ritual. Fifth, the victim's inability to resist effectively. Young children couldn't fight back, couldn't articulate compelling arguments for their own lives, couldn't organize political resistance. Their powerlessness made it easier to sacrifice them. If the victims had been armed adults capable of defending themselves, the practice would have been much more difficult to maintain. The modern discovery and interpretation of foundation sacrifice evidence has its own complex history. When archaeologists first began finding children's remains in foundation contexts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many refused to believe these were intentional sacrifices. They hypothesized that the children had died naturally and happened to be buried in foundation areas, or that they had died in construction accidents. This denial reflected both a reluctance to believe their Christian ancestors capable of such acts and a broader tendency to romanticize the Middle Ages. The medieval period was often imagined as a time of chivalry, faith, and moral clarity. Foundation sacrifice didn't fit this comfortable narrative, so it was explained away as misinterpreted evidence or exaggerated by ancient historians hostile to Germanic peoples. It was only in the late 20th century, as archaeological methods became more sophisticated and as historians became more willing to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, that foundation sacrifice was recognized as a real, widespread practice. Skeletal analysis could now determine with reasonable certainty whether remains were deliberately placed during construction versus added later. The consistency of findings across multiple sites made dismissing the evidence impossible. But even today, there's reluctance to fully acknowledge the scale and systematization of foundation sacrifice. Tourist guides at medieval churches rarely mention that the beautiful building might stand on the bones of sacrificed children. Museum displays of medieval architecture don't typically include discussions of foundation rituals. The practice remains a specialist topic discussed in academic journals but largely absent from popular historical consciousness. This continued invisibility mirrors the original invisibility of the victims. Just as the children were literally buried and forgotten, their stories remain buried in archaeological reports and obscure historical texts. They don't fit the narrative we want to tell about our ancestors or about the development of Western civilization. So they remain marginalized, mentioned briefly if at all, then set aside in favor of more comfortable topics. But these children deserve better. They deserve to be remembered not as anonymous bones in foundation contexts, but as individuals who suffered and died for beliefs we now recognize as horrifying. They deserve to have their stories told, not to inspire guilt in modern people who bear no responsibility for ancient practices, but to remind us that every age has its blind spots, its normalized cruelties, its practices that seem necessary or inevitable but are actually just choices we make. The child who was buried alive in Toledo in 589 AD had a name, though we don't know it. He had parents who loved him, or perhaps he was an orphan who had no one to protect him. He had thoughts and feelings and fears. He experienced the terror of being lowered into that pit, of watching the stones rise around him, of realizing that the adults he'd been taught to trust were going to kill him. His last moments were filled with fear and pain and incomprehension. Why was this happening? What had he done wrong? Why wasn't anyone helping him? Those questions echoed unanswered as the stones covered him and the light disappeared and his breathing became labored and finally stopped. His death bought nothing of value. The building he strengthened crumbled centuries ago. His sacrifice protected nothing and no one. He died for a superstition, for a belief system that treated children as raw materials for construction projects. And he wasn't alone. Hundreds of children, perhaps thousands, across several centuries, died this way. Each one had their own story, their own personality, their own dreams of growing up that were stolen from them. Each one died in terror. Each one was failed by every adult around them who had the power to stop this practice but chose not to. Modern visitors to historic churches and castles in Spain and southern France walk on floors that might be just meters above the bones of these children. The beautiful vaulted ceilings, the intricate stonework, the sense of sacred peace, all of it rests on foundations of horror. This doesn't mean we should tear down these buildings. They're part of our historical heritage, and destroying them wouldn't bring back the children who died. But we should remember what they represent. Every great civilization builds on foundations of suffering. The pyramids of Egypt were built by workers who died in their thousands. The Great Wall of China consumed countless lives. The railroads that connected America were built partly by Chinese laborers who died in dangerous conditions. Beautiful things often have ugly origins. The Visigothic churches are no different, except that their foundations contain children who were murdered deliberately, ceremonially, in the name of holy protection. This makes them particularly difficult to celebrate without qualification. We can admire the architectural achievement while acknowledging the moral catastrophe that made it possible. The practice of foundation sacrifice ended not because humans became morally superior, but because religious and political authority shifted in ways that made the practice untenable. The Carolingian church reform movement, the consolidation of royal power that made local customary practices easier to regulate, and the gradual development of legal frameworks that protected even low-status children. These structural changes ended the practice more than moral awakening did. This should be sobering. It suggests that our own era's moral blind spots probably won't be corrected by sudden ethical insight, but will require structural changes in power, law, and social organization. Whatever horrors future generations will judge us for, climate change, factory farming, technological unemployment, won't be fixed simply by good people recognizing they're wrong. They'll require systemic change that makes those practices impossible to continue. The children buried in Visigothic foundations remind us that normalization of cruelty is civilization's constant danger, that beautiful buildings can rest on terrible foundations, that religious language can sanctify horror, that tradition can perpetuate evil across generations, that vulnerability, whether from age or social status, makes people easy to sacrifice when sacrifice seems necessary. They remind us, most importantly, that every age believes its cruelties are justified, its sacrifices necessary, its victims somehow less important than the greater good being served. The Visigoths didn't think they were monsters. They thought they were building churches, protecting communities, serving God. They were wrong, and we're certainly wrong about things we consider normal today that future generations will judge as harshly as we judge foundation sacrifice. The bones in the foundations are quiet now. The children died long ago, their suffering over. But their stories shouldn't be silent. They should speak to us across centuries, warning us about what humans are capable of when we convince ourselves that cruelty serves a higher purpose. When we decide that some lives matter less than others. When we allow tradition to override compassion. When we bury uncomfortable truths and build beautiful structures on top of them. Remember the children in the foundations. Remember that they were real, that they suffered, that they mattered. And remember that the same impulses that placed them there, the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for perceived collective benefit, still exist in human societies today. They just wear different clothes and speak different languages. The question isn't whether our ancestors were monsters, though by our standards they certainly were. The question is what future generations will say about us. What foundations are we building our civilization on? Whose suffering are we normalizing, burying, forgetting? What will archaeologists centuries from now discover about our era that will make them recoil in horror? The children can't answer, but their bones in the foundations ask the question eternally. At what cost do you build your beautiful things?